John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we are reading Hellblazer number 79, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. John is back in England. He is trying to figure out what to do about the first of the Fallen, but it seems like he keeps getting distracted. I'm not sure if that's part of the first plan or not, but it seems like every time he starts to say, I need to think about, the first of the Fallen and what I'm going to do, something else comes up. So as he was beginning to think about all this again, he saw a woman on the street that he recognized who was a prostitute. And this was a woman named Helen that he knew before. We have not met her before, but apparently he used to go out with her. And she was a bit of a firecracker, but seeing her as a prostitute that was all doped up, he got very sad and wants to help her. So while Chaz beat the crap out of her pimp, John was able to pull her away and take her back to the flat of the current girl he's sleeping with, who's named Sarah, to ask her for help because her sister is a nurse. And of course, Sarah doesn't like this, but she does agree to help because she's a nurse, and obviously she doesn't want to see someone in pain. Now, in the background, the First of the Fallen is actually planning something for Constantine. He hasn't quite figured it out yet, but while he was thinking about it, he was approached by a young demoness. And we had actually seen this character before when she was a human. It is the little girl Astra who died in Newcastle when John was young and brash and did some stupid stuff. And she went to hell when she was a little girl, and she was a slave to the demon Nergal while she was in there, who was an old Constantine foe. And if you didn't know, when you're in hell and you're a human, you can work your way up into becoming a demon. So that is what she did. So she became a demon, and apparently all she has on her mind is revenge against John Constantine. So she approaches the First of the Fallen with a plan, and he likes this idea because obviously Astra, the demoness, will for sure throw John off if he sees her, and just the idea that she's getting him back is too sweet for him to pass up. So that's all the main story points from issue 78, and we start off with issue 79. Looking at the cover, we see John is standing looking at us very intensely, and he is holding a box in his hands, and inside that box is something that's glowing so bright that we can't really see what it is. There's just an aura of bright white light coming out from it. And John is in the foreground of the page, and next to him is a pair of bloody scissors that are like almost a third of his body size, so they're like very large. And then behind him in the background, we can see there's like a pool table on fire, it looks like. And behind this burning pool table, there are a bunch of buildings that are being blacked out by the smoke from this table. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And as we turn to the first page, we see Helen is freaking out. She is obviously detoxing off the drugs from last time, and she is not happy that John brought her here. So she is chasing him around the bedroom with a pair of scissors, and as she threatens John with them, she yells out, "Get away from me!" And John is trying to reason with her, saying, "Helen, love, for Christ's sake, put him down. Come on, quit friggin' about." And then he tries to walk towards her, but she does not like this. She lashes out with the scissors again and yells, "Get away!" And as John tries to dodge the scissors, he trips on a chair that is behind him, and he falls to the ground. And as he lands, he sees Helen standing over him saying, "I don't want your friggin' help. I hate you." And then she leans down in front of John's face and says, "You're a sodden frickin' bastard. I bloody hate you, and you take me back to Phil, or I'll kill you." And I guess just to show she means business, she actually cuts in between one of John's fingers, so like I guess the webbing area between his pointer and his ring finger on his left hand. And it's not just a little snip. It looks like she runs the whole length of the scissor blade down it. So it looks very painful, and she continues, I want my fix. I want my fix. You take me back to Phil. And John starts to beg with her, but just as he does that, someone comes out of nowhere and injects something into Helen's neck. And when we cut to the next panel, we see a larger white woman that looks like she doesn't take any shit. She kind of looks like a biker or something because she has a leather jacket on, and her reddish hair is kind of styled in a mullet. But it seems this is the doctor friend of Sarah's sister that they were going to ask for help from at the end of the last issue. So Helen immediately passes out from the injection, whatever that was. And the doctor, who looks pretty mad, takes Helen and puts her back on the bed. And as she does, she looks at Constantine as he gets up and says, "Are you Constantine?" And John says, "Yeah." And she replies, "You're a prick." And then John looks at her very sarcastically and says, "Me secret's out then." And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is Rake at the Gates of Hell Part 2. And as we turn the page, we see John is getting his hand bandaged by Sarah's sister Lucy. And John asks her, "How's Sarah, Luce?" And Lucy replies, "Homicidal. She'll be around later." And we can also see the doctor in this panel, and she's examining Helen. And as she takes Helen's vitals, she says out loud to everybody, "Dehydrated. Look, really, this woman has to go to the hospital." And then John comes over to her and says, "Joe, isn't it? Joe, Helen's pimp is a total sodden psychotic, and he's out for blood." And Joe replies, "He can't get at her in a hospital." But John cuts her off saying, "Hospitals are a cinch to get into, love. You know it yourself. They're so understaffed you can stroll around for hours without anyone twigging. How do you think Chaz got all your antibiotics in that?" But Joe snaps back to John, "I'm not your love. How are we supposed to keep an eye on her? I'm due at noon, you know." And John looks back at her with just as much contempt and says, "Yeah, I'm really grateful to you. I owe you one, right? Sarah will be here later, and we can take it in turns. Anything you need, ask Chaz." And we did see Chaz moving around in the background while all this was going on. I guess he was setting up a bunch of stolen medical equipment, like IV bag holders and stuff. But at the mention of his name, he looks at John and says, "Here, I'm meant to be working myself." And then John puts on his jacket and says, "Come on then." But before they can walk out the door, Joe looks at John and angrily says, "Just a second. I'm doing this because Lucy's my friend and Helen here is seriously ill. I don't know if you're trying to fix her entire life for her or whatever, but keeping her here in this condition is a mistake." And then she gives a look very intense and she says, "And don't you forget I said this." And then John and Chaz leave the apartment. We see Joe and Lucy are standing at the window watching them walk out to Chaz's car. And Joe says to Lucy, "Who does he think he is anyway?" And Lucy replies, "That's what Sarah always says. Thinks she's about to dump him. Suppose he thinks he's doing the right thing." And as Joe looks down at John, she says, "God save us all from people like that. All right, let's get on with it." Then we cut to John and Chaz as they're getting in the car, and Chaz is saying to John, "I know she's your ex, but junk? You never catch me at that. Mug's game." And John replies, "Bollocks." And Chaz looks up questioning at him, so John replies, "Bollocks. Anyone will do anything." And Chaz replies, "What? Come on, John. Everyone's got a line they reach." And then John very seriously looks at Chaz as he leans against the hood of the car and says, "Helen used to be the wildest woman I ever knew, Chaz. A night out with her, and you knew the reason we're all here. You knew what we could all be if we made the effort. She never drank or took anything, and I knew she'd never need to. And now look at the bleeding state of her. No one has a line, and no one has a sodden moral code either. Not outside a John Wayne movie." Then as they begin to drive away, Chaz says, "Well, I don't know." But it seems like John doesn't want to continue this conversation, so he changes the subject and he asks, "Where's me box then?" And Chaz answers, "In the back seat. You gonna tell me what's in it?" And John asks, "Didn't you look?" And Chaz replies, "Piss off. Last time I had a gander at the crap you keep in lockup, I had to sit through a friggin' Membrane video." Membrane, of course, being a reference to John's old punk band Mucus Membrane. So apparently Chaz had to watch a promotional video or music video of them. So as Chaz was talking, John reached back and got the box from the back seat, and he brings it up front, and he takes the lid off, and he shows Chaz what's inside. And what's inside is the bloody heart of the angel Gabriel. If you remember from a couple storylines back, John was able to get his demon friend Ellie to rip the heart of Gabriel out. And we haven't really seen what it does, but I believe it's assumed that if you have Gabriel's heart, you can control him. And when Chaz sees the heart in the box, he says, "Jesus!" And he was shocked by this because that's not what he expected to be in that box. And apparently he was so shocked that he lost control of the car for a second, and he yells at John, "You friggin' wanker, Constantine. I nearly crashed the sodden car." And John just smiles to himself as he gets a cigarette out, and he even offers one to Chaz, but Chaz says no. And Chaz doesn't question John anymore about the heart or anything. He actually changes the subject, asking John, "You hear about George Ridley?" And John looks up at him kind of concerned and says, "George? What about him?" And Chaz answers, "I was talking to Martin up at the hospital. He's only gone and shot a copper, hasn't he?" And John is very shocked by this, and he says, "Shot? So when the friggin' hell were you going to tell me? Or didn't you want to spoil the surprise?" Then we cut away from John and Chaz to a restroom where we see Phil, the pimp of Helen, is torturing a man for information. And this isn't just roughing up. He actually is holding a finger, so he's cut this man's finger off. And if you remember from last time, Chaz beat the crap out of Phil, so Phil has a broken nose and a black eye, and his lip is all fat. So he's talking kind of funny because of that. So he says to the man he's torturing, "I don't know what the problem is, Letty. I mean, you're meant to know everything, ain't you? You need to know something? Talk to Letty Fisher. That's what they say. So I tell you about these two, and you tell me the big one's Chandler, and the blonde one's Constantine, and then you clam up." And the whole time he's saying this, we see Lenny is just sitting on the toilet. He's holding his hand that's bleeding from the finger being cut off, and he's staring down at it in terror. And Phil continues, "So I get a bit more persuasive, and you still won't tell me where Constantine lives. I mean, what's up? You frightened of this bloke or something?" And it doesn't seem like Lenny's paying attention because he's so focused on his finger that's missing. And he says, "Oh my God." And Phil isn't really happy about this, so he says, "Letty? Well?" And then out of nowhere, he takes the shears in his hands and he cuts the center of Lenny's top lip down the middle. And as he does this, he yells, "'Cause I'm the fucking one you should be frightened of, you little fucking shit." And Lenny's so scared by this and in so much pain that he begins to cry, and he says, all right, I'm fucking talking." Then we cut to the crime scene at George's house. And if you remember, not only did his mom get killed, but George shot the policeman that killed her, which sent the officer out the window, and he landed on his back on top of a wall that had a bunch of spiky stuff, I assume to like stop birds from sitting on it. But that, of course, just stabbed into the officer's back as well. So we see two officers standing next to a bunch of blood and this wall. And one of them is like the captain because he's in uniform. And the other one is the officer who died's partner, and his name is Constable Kenfield. So the one in uniform says, "Who in God's name is Detective Inspector Constantine?" And Kenfield replies, "Don't you know him, sir?" And the captain snaps, "I've never bloody heard of him, Kenfield. Oh, Christ, wait a minute. Don't tell me." And Kenfield says, But he must have been one of ours, sir. I mean, I know I was a bit shaky after Shaw died, but he showed me ID. He even had some sergeant with him, Chandler. He was so genuine, I swear to God." So it seems John and Chaz made a stop by this crime scene after Chaz told John about George, and they pretended to be a couple police officers, and John probably used a little magic to make sure his badge and everything looked authentic. So the captain asked Kenfield, "Did you check his ID card?" And Kenfield answers, "Well, yes." And the captain snaps back, "Did you actually check it was an ID card?" And Kenfield just stammers, and the captain continues, "And you told him everything that happened to you and Shaw last night?" But Kenfield doesn't respond, and the captain already knows the answer. And he looks around, and he sees people in the neighborhood who we can see are mostly black, are staring at them from across the street. So the captain looks at Kenfield and kind of under his breath says, "Kenfield, if word gets out about Shaw and you're letting his killer escape, every little sod on this bloody estate is going to think he can get off with shooting a police officer. And with the mood these people are in, that's not an idea I want to encourage." And then he gets super close to Constable Kenfield's face, and he continues, "So some chancer from the press shows up, and he might as well call himself Detective Inspector Starsky, because Constable Kenfield is on the job, and he tells the bastard everything. Dickhead!" And as we turn the page, we cut to a very dilapidated apartment complex. And we hear from the outside John say, "Lovely view from up here, Nige." So it looks like this apartment that is totally run down and abandoned is where John's friend Nigel, who we met in the Royal Blood storyline, is squatting at. Then we cut closer to the building and we see John is out on the balcony and he's looking down at the courtyard below, which is also in bad shape. And he's commenting on everything he's seeing from, I guess, the other people that live in this area. And he says to Nigel behind him, "Guy dealing something behind that garage. Big tart showing some leg over there. Oh shit, It's the face that sank 1,000 ships. Give it up and go home, love. Kids breaking windows. Is that fat bloke gonna piss all over the blue Fiesta? He is, you know. Feisty British street life, eh? And then John turns to walk back into the apartment, and Nigel says, yeah, it's mental around here at the moment. A couple of Pakistani kids got stabbed last year the day after I moved in. And things are pretty strange for me, too. And John asks, oh? And Nigel replies, well, for one thing, Olivia left me. And John cuts in, so you're catching up on your masturbation. And Nigel doesn't really like that, and he says, ha bloody ha. You never change, do you? All you ever do is mock and denigrate. It's easy for you. You haven't suffered the trauma and hardship I have. Look at this. Look at what they sent me. So this is a callback gag, actually. If you remember, when John was heading to the States before the whole witch-walking incident with Papa Midnight, he was reading some material on the plane that had an advertisement for some sort of weird church group that wanted to send you stuff about anti-witchcraft and Satan and everything like that. So John, as a joke, signed Nigel up for a mail order of their entire catalog. So Nigel pulls out a booklet that says, Together We'll Beat Satan on the front, and he shows it to John, and he says, it showed up at my mom and dad's place. I must have been on some evangelist list. And as John flips through it, he just kind of chuckles to himself, and he says, dark influences on society, all walks of life. Sega is the creation of Beelzebub. Too right, I can't play Sonic to save my life. But with Jesus showing us his glowing passageway, life need not be the dark tunnel that sinners would have us travel. Welcome to the crusade. And as John hands Nigel back the pamphlet, Nigel continues saying, in Christ, wait till I tell you about the goldfish. And then he hands John some kind of snack that Nigel says is called sprouts and raisin nibbles. And as John tries eating them, Nigel continues, Kim and Mary were around the other night. Haven't seen them since college. We had a few beers and it turned out Kim was possessed. And John doesn't seem to believe this, and Nigel can see the look on his face. So Nigel says, yeah, they were messing about with Ouija, you know, classic symptoms. And then I guess the sprouts and raisins that John was eating taste bad, so he spits them out and he says, well, you are psychic, Nige. And Nigel replies, yeah, but I was too pissed to read her mind. So Mark said they'd had a joint earlier and that it helped a bit, right? And then John kind of smiles to himself because he knows where this is going. And he finishes Nigel's story saying, and you gave them your stash. And Nigel says, yep, lent them the Von Adden book on exorcism too. I tell you what, they're lucky they came to me. And John says, they certainly are. And then Nigel continues, anyway, the goldfish. The next day, Vic and Bob start swimming around their bowl really fast. And then they suddenly float to the top. And they lie there, perfectly still, dead. And John doesn't really know where this story's going, so he says, And Nigel looks up at him and says, well, don't you see? The spirit left Kim and went into Vic and Bob. My goldfish were possessed. And you know something, Constantine? That's not the worst. Did you see the last NME? Which I guess is some kind of magazine. Because John replies, haven't read it in ages. And Nigel continues, oh, well, I did a review for them of Bleeding Rectum, Belfast band. Anyway, it doesn't matter who. The point is, they paid me for it. I've exchanged my creativity for cash, Constantine. I've sold out. I'm just a dirty whore. And John, who's trying not to laugh, is saying, no, for God's sake, Nige, come on, wise up. You're not a whore. You just did a bloody record review. You need the money, don't you? And apparently this confession was very stressful on Nigel because he is crying in his hands as John is talking to him. So Nigel says, but that's how they get you. And John says, not if you don't let them. It's just the way of it, son. We all sell our souls sooner or later. And as Nigel wipes his eyes, he says, well, maybe. But he's cut off by John before he can say anything because John isn't here for like a social call. He's just been nice listening to Nigel's stupid stories in order to get to this point because John cuts him off saying, yeah, here, look, this will cheer you up. And then he pulls the box that is holding Gabriel's heart out and he opens the lid and shows it to Nigel. And Nigel says, Christ almighty, is this it? And John says, yep. And its owner should show up as the biggest blip on the psychosphere since the last time Uri Geller farted, mate. Find him for me. So there it is. John came here to have Nigel pinpoint where Gabriel is located by using his heart. Then we cut to George, who is on the run, hiding from the police, obviously, and he is hiding out in some sort of janitor's closet or maybe a unit in a storage facility because he's just sitting on the ground on top of a bunch of blankets that are like pushed against the wall. And there's a bunch of cleaning and maintenance supplies in the room on the floor around him. And we hear someone off camera say, "George?" And as George looks up, he sees 4 black people looking at him. 3 of them look kind of young, like they're George's age, and one looks a little bit older. And the older one is dressed in like a nice suit and jacket. And the younger ones are dressed in like t-shirts and jeans and hoodies. And out of those 3, 2 of them are men and 1 is a woman. And the one in the hoodie says, "Bloody hell, Georgie, we're here for your benefit, ain't we? Try and pay attention for 5 bleeding minutes." And it seems that George is just spaced out in the middle of a conversation with them. So he says, "Sorry, so he's definitely dead?" And his friend in the t-shirt says, "Saw it myself. Arm came off when they were getting him down off the wall." And the woman out of the 3 is kind of shocked by this graphicness, and she says, "Jesus, Will." And Will continues, "It'll be on the news as soon as they can work out how to make you sound as bad as possible. I doubt they'll mention your mom. They'll be coming after you anyway, but they'd rather not have the rest of us start rioting when they do, which is why we're here." And then the friend in the hoodie says, "Yeah, no way are Babylon taking you anywhere, Georgie." And the female friend turns to him and says, "Shut up, Spaz." And the friend in the hoodie looks at her angrily and says, "It's Zap, Shelly, not Spaz. Zap, all right." And then the friend in the t-shirt, Will, kind of cuts those 2 off and asks George, "What'd they want you for anyway?" And George replies, "Dealing. It was all bollocks. All I had was a lump left over from Christmas. I reckon it was really because of that march on B&P headquarters. I did a bit of damage that day, remember?" Then Will looks at his friends and says, "They could lift a lot of us, you know. All they do is say they're taking your associates in for questioning. They could nick everyone who's ever given the B&P any shit at all." And Shelley says, "Who'd believe them?" And Will answers, "Who'd care, Shelley? We're all just blacks to the folk in TV land." Then the guy who looks older that's standing next to them in the suit says, "We should have joined up with the B&P in the front in the first place, man. Would have avoided this. And they'd have got rid of the Asians and the Arabs for us." And the 3 friends can't really believe what this older guy just said. So Zap yells out, "You what? We'd be next in the bleeding gas chamber, you stupid sodden git." And then Shelley looks with disgust at the man and says, "Why are we even talking to this guy?" And the man looks down at her and says, "'Cause I know Deacon, bitch." And she yells back, "Don't you call me a bitch." And Zap looks at the man and says, "Paul Deacon's a freaking crack-dealing bastard." And the man kind of smiles and looks at Zap and says, "Yeah, and he runs this place. And he's the only hope you've got when the filth come for Georgie boy. 'Cause without his say-so, no one will lift a friggin' finger." And then Will, who seems to realize that they don't want to deal with this man, but they kind of have to, says, "We know that, Frank. Later." As we turn the page, we see Frank is walking away from a garage that's open, and it turns out that George is actually staying in someone's garage. We're not sure exactly whose. And as the 3 friends watch Frank walk away, Zap says, "I should have bloody twatted him one." And Shelley says to him, "Stroll on, Spaz." And Zap gets very angry that she won't say his name right, so he looks at her and says, "ZAP, Zap." But before they can argue more, George cuts in saying, "Look, I'm grateful to you for hiding me, but this is my problem, right? I don't want some sodden riot started because of me." And Will looks down at him and says, "What you want's got nothing to do with it anymore." And George looks at him kind of annoyed and says, "Come again?" And Will looks back at him just as hard and says, "They're coming after us, mate. And when they do, all of Tower Hamlets is going to go up in flames. Even Deacon couldn't stop it. With him, we've got a chance to be ready for him. But that's about all. It was bound to happen eventually. Place has been holding its breath for the last couple years, waiting for someone to chuck the first stone. Just turned out to be you, I suppose. I was mates with your brother, George. I thought Des was a diamond bloke, and it broke me up when he died. But he'd say the same. All your choices have been made for you. Your side's been picked for you. Only one thing you can do with it now, and that's live with it." And at this last line, George has a very kind of shocked look on his face, as if he's just realized the amount of shit that's not only going to rain down on him, but on his entire community. Then we cut to a park bench somewhere where we see the angel Gabriel is sitting, and he hasn't really changed since the last time we saw him, which was right after Ellie pulled out Gabriel's heart and John cut off his wings with a chainsaw. So Gabriel now just kind of looks like a homeless person. He's got shoes that don't have any laces, pants that are too short, and he has no shirt, but he has a blanket draped over him that is green, and there are big red blood spots on the back where his wings used to be. It seems like he's just sitting there talking to himself as he says, "All I do is wander. I can see no point to my existence any longer, but to end it means damnation and agony eternal. And that only adds fear to my already wretched outlook. My wings still hurt dreadfully, and the wounds you caused when you tore them from me have never ceased to bleed. Where I once strode the halls of paradise, now I trudge around this dungeon of a city like some shade in limbo. I have fallen from grace, and yet each day can only bring some new misery to cast me still lower. That is my lot in its entirety." Then we get a panel of John lighting a cigarette, and it turns out he's standing right next to Gabriel, but he was off panel while Gabriel was talking earlier. And as he lights his cigarette, he says, you know, when I said, "So Gabriel, son, how have you been?" I was really just taking the piss. And Gabriel replies, "I had hoped I had heard the last of you." And John looks up at him and says, "You can't hide from me, Gabe. Not so long as I've got your ticker tucked away. But cheer up. Your big moment has arrived." And Gabriel, still looking dejected, looks at him and says, "Oh?" And John says, "Yep, I'm getting a bit of a trap ready for your old adversary. Know who I mean?" And Gabriel replies, "Yes." And John continues, "Of course you do. I'll set him up for you. Then you kick 7 shades of shit out of him. He was never in your league, so I reckon you'll breeze it. You do a good job, I might even consider giving you your heart back." And at those words, Gabriel actually gets a little bit of hope and looks up at John and he says, "You would?" But John just smiles at him slyly and says, "Nah, I'm only joking. But I maybe leave you alone for a bit." Then Gabriel asks, "Do I really deserve such incessant cruelty?" And John gets kind of serious and says, "That's funny. That's what Rick the Vic asked me. And you know what I said to him? I said, 'Rick, with the things that enormous Aryan bastard's done in the name of his Lord down the ages, I think I'm letting him off bloody lightly.'" And Gabriel gets kind of bitter and says, "You may dress it up whatever way you choose, Constantine. It is still nothing but petty mortal spite." And John replies, "Yeah, well, I'm only human, aren't I? You're the angel. I'll be in touch." And then he walks away from Gabriel and back to Chaz's car. And as John gets in, he says, "All right." And Chaz replies, "Just put on the radio about George." And as John closes the door, he looks kind of angry and says, "Well, what'd you expect me to do about it? You heard that bastard constable this morning. Cops are bloody straining to be let loose. I have enough on my plate, chum. Look, after you drop me off, do us a favor and check up on Helen, all right?" And Chaz reluctantly says, "All right." And then John says, "George will have to make do on his own." And then his narration says, "'Cause it's messy enough as it is, taking on the bloody devil and trying to help Helen. Feels like the shit's gathering around me just when I need it the least. Not good at all." Then we cut back to Sarah's flat where we hear someone say, "Helen." And at this, Helen begins to open her eyes. And as she looks up, she sees Phil, her pimp, standing in front of her bed. And as she looks up at him, we see that Sarah's sister Lucy is tied up and gagged next to the bed. So it seems Phil has found her. Then we cut to Limbo where we see the first of the fallen is saying, "You know something. In all my time as king of hell, no matter how much power I had at my disposal, or the ease with which I could indulge my whims, it always irked me that I would never know what Christmas felt like." Then we get a zoomed out panel where we can see the first is saying this to Astra and also the other 2 members of the Triumvirates, who are the other 2 kings of hell. And Astra says to the first, "Wonder no longer, Lord Satan." And the first replies, "Indeed." And just in case you forgot what the other 2 kings of hell look like, one of them is just a black void. So the way they have them in Limbo is they're surrounded by like a red bubble. Maybe it's like protecting them or something, or it's some kind of shield. But one of them is just a blackness inside of this red bubble. And the other one looks like some sort of giant tentacle monster, but it's being compressed inside of this red bubble. So the first of the fallen looks at them and says, "So, my brothers, nothing to say? No questions? No pleading? Aren't you wondering how I broke a deadlock designed to last an eternity? Come on, don't be so sullen. Speak up." But the 2 kings do not say anything. So the first of the fallen continues, saying, "Well, how about this? I'll do the talking, and you can join in when you want. Where to begin? For a start, you aren't my brothers. And it wasn't a deadlock at all. It was just a bluff. The 3 of us have been victims of the greatest bluff of all time. Then we hear the tentacle monster king of hell say, "What?" And then the first of the fallen moves very close to that king's bubble, and he says, "You are talking. Let me congratulate you incidentally in getting caught in such a particularly stupid shape. You look like one of those pit cretins with not enough vowels in his name." And the tentacle monster king of hell replies, "What do you mean? We're not brothers." And the first of the fallen replies, "I mean, we're not. The creator bluffed us. He dealt the cards at the table when the world began, and then he left us to it. He's probably still laughing. I am called the devil. It is not a title that I mind. Mortals have to call me something, but it is totally inaccurate. I fell before there were even angels to become devils, or demons, or whatever. When I got to the bottom, there wasn't even a hell for me to rule. That came later, with Lucifer. Anyway, when you two popped up with your power equal to mine to balance my rule over the inferno that grew up around me, I assumed you were in precisely the same boat as I was. But you weren't, were you? You are devils, exceptionally powerful lords of hell, but devils all the same. And you in turn assumed that I was the same as you. We each mistook the other for our equal, but we were wrong. Our power is equal, yes, but our particular strengths are not, and neither are our weaknesses." Then the Black Void King of Hell says, "This cannot be true." But the first points at him and says, "Can it not? Can you remember us even once warring upon each other? Oh, we threatened and posed and bared our fangs until we were blue in the face, but we never actually tested the balance of the triarchy, did we? What we've done down all the aeons is to keep hell from being any threat to him whatsoever, which was precisely his intention in the first place. There's no probably about it. He'll still be laughing his bloody head off." And then the Void asks, "How did you discover?" And the first of the fallen answers, "Oh, I just put two and two together. I went mad with rage when I finally realized, I don't mind telling you. I don't think there's an entity left in my palace with its soul still intact. But once I got it out of my system, I saw the positive side after all, as you two are devils, and not just called such as I thought. I needed nothing more than a simple holding spell. I, on the other hand, might be called the devil, but I am not. So the same trick won't work on me. All in the naming, eh? Which brings us right up to date. You're screwed, and I'm not." And then the first of the fallen raises his hand towards the two other kings of hell, and the tentacle monster king yells, "No!" And it seems like his bubble begins to squeeze in on him. And then the first of the fallen says, "I should take my time with you, shouldn't I? You know, shit in your faces, bend you over heaven's gate and give it to you till you scream. That kind of thing. But why bother? This is Constantine's big day, not yours." And as he squeezes the bubble tighter, we hear the tentacle monster king of hell yell, "No!" And then the bubble collapses in on itself, and the monster that was inside explodes as well. And we get what I guess is its blood spurting out all over and floating in this limbo. Then the first of the fallen turns to the Void and says, "As for you," and the Void pleads, "Wait." But the first does not wait. With an evil smile on his face, he says, "Let there be light." And immediately his bubble fills up with light, which I guess negates the void that's in there and kills it. Then we're just left with the first of the fallen looking very pleased with himself and the Astra demoness floating behind him. And as the first of the fallen smiles at his work, he doesn't look back, but he says to Astra, "After Constantine, my lady Astra, hell will provide your reward." And then he takes off flying, and as he flies away, he says to her, "As for the man himself, well, you just watch this. You're going to like it." And as Astra watches him leave, she looks at the mess of yellow blood and what looks kind of like star twinkles, I guess is what's left over from the light that he killed the Void with. And then she puts out her hand and she begins to shape the blood and the light into something. We don't know, but she has kind of like a blank look on her face. And as she's crafting whatever she's crafting, she says, "After Constantine, Lord Satan, hell will be my reward." Then we see what she has crafted, and she's holding it in her hand, and it looks like she's made a dagger or maybe a short sword, and it's still yellow from the color of the blood, and there is a face that is carved into the blade guard of it. So it seems she's taken the power of the two kings of hell that were killed and formed it into a weapon that she's going to use to take over Hell from the First of the Fallen. But we'll have to wait to see what happens with that until the next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.